Hi, everyone. I'm Zarina Zabriskie. I'm an author from San Francisco, and I host these programs, Globus Books, literary and cultural programs. Globus Books is an independent store. We've been in the Bay Area, San Francisco, for 50 years. We are going to celebrate our anniversary this year, and you will hear more about it in the nearest future. So we've been around from 1971, and we offer a wide range of stock of books of all things Russia and former Soviet Union. We're actively working with the university libraries across the states on completing their reserves on the Russian publications, both contemporary and out of print. We are also featuring a big collection of all sorts of books, so children's literature, classic literature, avant-garde literature in Russian and in English. We're building up our English language collection, and I would like to emphasize that we do have the literary translation roundtable series, which is magnificent. Check it out on our YouTube channel. Please sign up. And with that being said, I'm very excited to bring to you Polina Barskova with her lecture on the and reading and an interview on the non-official poetries of the Siege of Leningrad. And she will explain why poetry is in plural. Most of you probably know or heard about Polina and her book Седьмая щелочь, Seventh Alkaline, just won yet another award in Russia. Polina began to publish her poetry at age 9 and is the author of 8 books of poems that have garnered national awards in Russia. 2 collections of her poetry in English appeared recently, The Lamentable City and The Zoo in Winter. She's also a published scholar with degrees in classical literature from St. Petersburg University and Slavic languages and literatures from UC Berkeley. Her research concerns Soviet Russia literature of the 30s, and she has forthcoming books on cultural life during the Siege of Leningrad. She currently teaches Russian literature at Hampshire College and lives in Amherst, Massachusetts, but we're here that soon she will be moving to San Francisco Bay Area and joining us here to teach in UC Berkeley. Polina, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm passing the microphone to you for poetry reading. Then we will do an interview, and then our audience will have a chance to ask questions.
Tonight, my task is to introduce some names, which is kind of curious because I guess that some of our listeners know these authors very well, but maybe also some texts, some nuances of their work, some of their quests, if you wish. In general, this is a conversation about 2 books. The first one was published in this country, and I wanted to say that there is something almost weird, whimsical about talking about poetry during the siege in English. But the first anthology of the unofficial poetry written during the siege was published in New York by Ugly Duckling Press, so it makes sense that English is one of our languages, one of their languages now. And I absolutely believe that these authors deserve universal international reading. This anthology came out several years ago. It's called Written in the Dark, 5 Poets in the Siege of Leningrad. And a very serious group of translators participated. Matvey Nkilevich, Evgeny Astashevsky, Eugene Astashevsky, and Slimors, but also Rebecca Smith, but also younger translators. It was a very interesting workshop project. I was very happy with it. I was very happy with its reception, both here in the United States. I've heard from many people who read it and who thought this material. But then I thought that this anthology also with some interesting additional materials and articles, for example, by a remarkable scholar from Moscow, Ilya Kukulin, I thought that it's somehow not enough, even for this very limited project. Maybe this word non-official is something that irritated me in good way, in bad way, you know, in irritating way. I began thinking, I began feeling that it's more complicated than that. Though, of course, bringing to the reader today people who were not published before or were published problematically, this seems to be one's primary task, just to bring poetry from the darkness towards light of reading, interpretation, reaction. But poetry during the siege, and this is one of my main arguments and one of my main, again, emotions, curiosities. Poetry during the siege of Leningrad was a whole universe of its own, rather voluminous in its scale. We are talking about, I would say, dozens of authors. And this problem of being official, of being non-official, of being for publication or not for publication is extremely important for it. And it creates all kinds of questions and problems. This is why sometimes I feel that studying culture of the siege of Leningrad, of the disaster, right, that happened in 1941, it allows one to understand some very curious and difficult and important things about Soviet culture in general. And so the idea emerged that maybe I should write something about this whole world of poetry during the siege, bringing together people who knew very well that they cannot publish what they were writing, that it was not for the contemporary reader, and people who wrote to be published immediately, like, for example, Olga Bergolz, whose poetry would go directly to the radio committee, and it would be broadcasted to the whole city. And nevertheless, these authors are celebrities of the disaster, and the invisible shadows, they were connected in many, many curious ways. So I thought that writing a book, putting together an anthology of not just unofficial poets, but poets of various stances in terms of officialdom and propaganda and ideology, would be interesting. It took me, I think, like 7 years to put together this rather slim volume with a strange name. My publisher, Irina Kravtsova of the Limbach Press, she really, really pressed hard for the name that would work. And at some point, I understood that there is this combination of words which I thought is very interesting, expressive, and I have no idea what it means. Седьмая щелочь or седьмая щелочь, the seventh alkali, depending. It comes from a poem by Natalia Krandievskaia, one of the authors in this book. Этот год нас омыл, как седьмая щелочь, о которой когда-то мы, помнишь, мечтали. Потому нас и радует каждая мелочь. Оттого и моложе, как будто мы стали. This year has cleansed us like the seventh alkali that we dreamed of as children. Do you remember? This is why nowadays every little thing is of joy for us. That is why we feel so much younger now. We asked everybody, Krandievskaia's relatives, being Tatiana Tolstoy and Yelena Tolstoy, specialists on Krandievskaya and Alexei Tolstoy, what we were able to find out that in Tolstoy's epic novels trilogy, Хождение по мукам, we find третья щелочь, mysterious chemical, alchemical element that when used brings truth out, up in people. And we can guess that седьмая щелочь is also a magical element of that order, but obviously connected to horror of the historical experience. And every reader is free to interpret this седьмая щелочь in our own way. For me, this very thing that happened in 1941, 1942, that brought individual poetry, individual literary quest of these people to the place, to the momentum of its utmost intensity. Because one can argue, and I do argue in this book, that it was that winter that most of these people wrote their strongest. Which is not to say that writing during the calamity, writing during the season of hell, the season of suffering is highly recommended. But if you find yourself in the season of hell, this is something that might happen. I thought about various names, various persona, various poets whom I wanted to bring together in this book. There were some choices, as I've mentioned. But again, the idea was to connect, to bring together for this dreadful party, so to say, very different writers who nevertheless had this fate to describe one event through their very different lenses. So this book speaks about Gennady Gor, Pavel Zal'tsman, Natalia Krandievskaia, Tatiana Gnedich, Ольга Бергольц, Николай Тихонов, Sergey Rudakov, Zinaida Shishova. I will introduce very briefly two of them, just to give us some idea what is this world, to open the door somewhat. If you might recall a famous film by Alexander Sokurov, Русский ковчег, where the Russian Ark, where they travel around Russian history, being situated in the Hermitage. There is a moment when they open a door and the protagonist says, maybe we shouldn't go there in that time. And this is the door of the siege. And this image became very important for me for a number of reasons. But maybe since our task is very different, it is the opposite. It is to try to open this door. Maybe these are the texts and these are the names that might help us. The first one is Tatiana Gnedich. She is becoming more and more well known, especially for people who study translation and history. She has a very doubtful fame of having translated Canto of Byron's Don Juan in the cell of the big house, one of the main prison institutions of Leningrad, and she translated it from memory. And then the person who was interrogating her helped her with paper. There was this kind of, again, horrific and sentimental story about the investigator who helped Gnedich. And in the camps later on, she really translated Don John, but which is completely unimaginable and endlessly symptomatic. But before the camp story, there was a siege story. Gnedich, indeed a specialist on the 19th century British, mostly romantic poetry, found herself in the siege where she wrote, and also she translated. Gnedich was the author of the first anthology of the siege poetry in translation into English, for which we never saw следственное дело, but there are some speculations, and there are all kinds of diaries and of people around her. The rumor being that her work with English for the Westerners was one of the possible reasons of her arrest and punishment. And what did she translate? She translated, of course, official poetry into English, right? People like Tikhonov and Inber and Bergoez. A poem that I will read now, I wanted to say it's one of my favorite. It is one of my favorite. They all are one of my favorite. But there is something completely unbearable about this one. It's called «Последняя кошка». Время что-то медлило немножко, шли часы, ночь как будто шла, но цепляясь за косяк, за ножку, за мечтанье, за узор стекла, в середине ночи призрак, кошка, мягко соскочила со стола. Соскочила и пошла к окошку посмотреть, как вьюга занесла. И в густом молчанье слышно было, как она по комнатам бродила, нюхала кастрюльки и лари, как она заглядывала в крынки, двигала иссохшие корзинки и лакала проблески зари. Time ran slowly, and yet the clock was ticking and night was flowing, with difficulty clinging to furniture, to dreams, to the frosted windows. And in the middle of the night, a ghost of a cat emerged to gaze at the snow outside of the window. And in dense silence, I could hear how the cat wandered the rooms, sniffed the pots and pans and the boxes, looked in the jars and the dried out baskets, and drank the very first light of dawn. When we talk about poetry of the siege and when I make claims that it's unknown, of course, this is already a huge problem because siege was publicized from its very beginning. Lots of poetry was published, lots of poetry was written and published, and we can talk about some very known poetry of the siege. So the question is, what is the difference between known and unknown? What are the criteria? And this is a very exciting thing to discuss. It's complicated. Problems of censorship and self-censorship, right? And brutally simplifying this complicated and interesting problem, which is one of the main problems of this book. I would say that the poetry that had very little chance to be published is poetry about the self, poetry about individual experience, as indifferent to the poetry of the collective experience of the siege. Gnedich, by the way, wanted her siege poetry to be published very much. She didn't write this for the desk. We can say, and it's always nice to say this with the hindsight, right? Without that, she was rather naive, thinking that a poem about the ghost of the cat could be published at the time. For her, it was, right, a lyrical miniature about some kind of domesticity. What we see here is a Gothic text about total disappearance and about total loneliness, and framed by a almost obnoxious historical detail about what actually happened to the cats in Leningrad, which is very important. Cats were eaten sometime around November, December of 1941, and especially in the families of intelligentsia, and family of Tatiana Gnedich was kind of an exemplary family of this kind. Very often, this event became the event of no return of human, of the experience and reception, sensation that something is damaged. We also can say that this is a poem about, yes, the ghost of the cat, the ghost of the family that was there but no more. And this is a poem about her mom. Gnetich's mother, this brilliant, witty woman, is бывших, an aristocrat, as Gnedich was, died during the siege, as parents of most of the poets whom one studies in this period. Since people who didn't work, they got this very special card, rations, карточки, called the карточка иждивенца, the dependents, which equaled basically immediate death. And this is what happened. Zal'tsman's parents died, Gnedich's, many others in this book. And this cat becomes a symbol, obviously. It's an allegorical poem, as most of Gnedich's poetry, right? About ghosts that become very important for people who deal with the besieged Leningrad at the moment in 1941, 1942, but also after the event. This is why it becomes such a problem for many to return to the city of memory, and to the city of missing family members and lovers and friends and so on. But also why I find this poem so striking, that yes, it's deeply personal. It's seemingly very observant and touching. There is nothing radically avant-garde in its poetics, unlike what we'll see in a moment with the next poet. It's beautiful, formally, and that's why on certain level it's almost even more unbearable, I would say, right? Beautifully made, formally executed, perfectly rhymed and all that poem about a cat that was eaten. Something that later on people who to whom this happened either cannot remember at all, or remember as the one of the most traumatic things that happened to them. And Gnedich, who another remarkable thing about her, and about her life in the besieged city, that she taught English that winter, if you can imagine that, to people like her, to women like her. If you can imagine, and maybe some future generation of writers will write this play. I discussed this with Eugene Ostashevsky, that we should make a list of future plays or novels or non-novels, whatever it takes, teaching Byron in Leningrad in 1941. So this is Gnedich's story. Again, she desperately wanted to be published. She discussed it. She read her poetry to her friends, gave a couple of readings, was arrested. Our next poet, Gennady Gor, never gave readings, never read one poem of his written during the siege, during his lifetime. Эдгара По «Нелепая улыбка», Сервантеса «Неловкая походка», ненужная, но золотая рыбка, тревожная, опасная находка. Меня убьют, я знаю, в понедельник и бросят тут же, где и умывальник, и будет мой убийца умываться и удивляться там, где целоваться, и, умываясь, будет улыбаться. The uneasy smile of Poe, the ungainly gait of Cervantes, the unneeded but golden fish, the unsettling dangerous find. They'll kill me, I know, on Monday and fling me right here by the washstand, and my killer will stand washing and marveling where it's for kissing and stand smiling while he washes. Translation of Benjamin Felter-Quinn and Eugene Ostashevsky. Though obviously very different from Gnedich. Gnedich, again, reads 19th century people like Byron and Wordsworth, is obsessed with acmeism. She's this frozen reader of the Silver Age poetry, and throughout her whole writing career, she kind of regurgitates this poetry. Gor is close to Harms and that circle, and he brings that into the siege. He brings broken language. He brings the very question about language. As I explained it to myself, Gnedich writes people like Gnedich, who can become paired to Krandievskaia to some extent, to Andreev, to Rudakov. They write beautiful poetry about something unrepresentable, not just ugly or horrible, but without image, which is one approach, problematic and endlessly interesting, and bring its own fruit. While people like Goran, Zal'tsman, and Sterligov, right? So their way, their path is to write безобразное о безобразном, ugly about ugly, despicable about despicable, unspeakable, as Yuzarina suggested. But in both texts and in both oeuvres, in Gnedich and in Gor, one of the claims that we find, it's of course claim of intelligentsia, as it was called in 1930s in the Soviet Union, right? Gor is trying to understand what is the place of, I don't know, Edgar Allan Poe during the Siege of Leningrad. Gnedich is trying to find a place for her cat. Gnedich is trying to find a place for Byron. They both are desperately trying to find place. This image from Gor that I do find to be so striking and such a wound image, right? Traumatic image. Не нужно, но золотая рыбка. And in a way, this is kind of the symbol of the whole problem. Why were they writing poetry? And in general, in this kind of situation, at the very bottom of existence, as one diarist called it, на дне, существование. Why such highly aestheticized aesthetic forms emerge? This is a difficult and very real question. And so I thought that with these two examples, with these two personae, we can begin our conversation, and maybe I will bring more people.
It's one of the hardest program that I had hosted so far. It took me a while to get through the anthologies in Russian and in English, just because it was very difficult emotionally to read. And for our English-speaking audience, of which Globus has quite a bit, and people who are interested in Russian Soviet culture and history, but are not as familiar with it, pretty much every family in former Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was in one way or another touched by the siege. Everybody has history. Most people either lost someone physically, the people died because the different estimates, but about 1.5 million people perished. The general consensus, I believe, Polina, correct me if I'm wrong. And my family was no exception. From my father's side, my grandmother's whole family died from starvation, including her brother, who was 19 and who was a poet and who also wrote poetry. And I saw that poetry, and then it went missing. We had other members of the family who actually survived and lost their minds. So in a way, they are missing pieces in the family history because nobody spoke about them anymore on the other side of the family. The whole missing phenomenon is something that I wanted to start the questions with. In one of your lectures, you mentioned that the poems that are collected in the Written in the Dark, or Седьмая Щелочь, were not supposed to see the light of the day at all or meet the readers, and some were discovered upon poets' deaths, and others were intended to be burned by the family members who were imprisoned for safety reasons. They wanted to get rid of them. And just today you were talking about the complete disappearance phenomena in general. So there is a strong missing element in this book. And in a way, it's not just writing in the dark, but it's also reading in the dark. And I was really hit by a very simple piece of a poem, and I can't locate the poet now, but you help me. It's «В дом, которого нет, город, которого нет, стихи, которых нет, поэт, которого нет». The house that doesn't exist, city that doesn't exist, poems that do not exist, a poet that doesn't exist. You have brought them back to light, to life in a Lazarus manner. So how do you do it? Do you have your own family story that propels you to do that? And how do you find strength to do that?
Thank you for a number of remarkable and difficult and important questions. I don't have any members of my direct family who died or survived. And it's becoming kind of an important part of my story because so many friends of mine do. Because so many people I meet in that city, of course they do. So in a way, I see myself not so much as Lazarus, but I think sometimes as a rather like a Charon figure, somebody like a conductor. And I do it because I really, really admire this poetry and this work. And also, I find it to be absolutely fascinating. Of course, I'm curious in writing people who find themselves in all kinds of situations and what happens to one's writing system and one's writing capacities. And as looking at all these poets, every time one sees something very interesting, this very question of how and why one writes during the historical disaster, uh, how the very capacity to write about it, how it changes you, how it helps you, or maybe it doesn't. One of the main things that my teachers, various people in Berkeley, Leningrad, in Amherst, taught me that you go with the honest and direct questions. Does poetry really help? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's useless. Let's look at their biographies. Let's look at the what they call now fashionably ego tests, which means diaries and later rewritten diaries, memoirs. Um, so my personal reasons, it just I find it absolutely fascinating to read them. Also, being in that city, I think is very much for me is about this unbelievable moment in its history when it lost at least 1/3 of its population over a couple of months. And I still do think and that it's our responsibility, it's my responsibility to do everything possible and sometimes impossible, uh, just kind of to bring our attention, to give us pleasure of reading them. But, and the very fact that so many people, like you just now, said that it's about my grandmother, it's about my grand aunt, it's about our neighbor, right? This texture of memory, of familial memory, of some all kinds of connections. You showed me before we started the photograph of a beautiful woman who was there, and all these pictures and all these diaries and all these texts. It happened so, such a Soviet history that we are studying, that it is very much now that we're trying to locate our questions and formulate them. And each of us for our own reasons. I don't know, my reasons being, again, as I said, when I begin thinking about Gnedich with her passionate desire to be published and total disaster of her life and total triumph of her life and strangeness of her life and this poetry that is so absurdly beautiful, which sometimes I think is almost obscene. And on some level, when we read post-Aboriu people, avant-garde people like Gore and Zal'tsman, that is for us now in the 21st century is more understandable than when people write this kind of museum pieces of beauty about a family devouring its cat. But you asked me at the beginning why I say poetries. Uh, well, maybe just pretentious, but this is my attempt to highlight how different they are. Though again, there are all kinds of connections. There is a proverb, a quote from a famous Soviet film, "Leningrad город маленький." Mostly they knew each other. Sometimes there are all kinds of curious connections if you read their letters and diaries. For example, in the diary of one of the bosses of Leningrad siege culture, Всеволod Vishnevsky. His diaries are published. He describes his visit to a house of the former beauty, бывшая красавица, where she tells him that she spends most of her time with a rat. This beauty is Natalia Krandievskaia, with whom we started, by then an abandoned wife of the most prolific, successful Soviet writer Alexei Tolstoy. Krandievskaia chooses not to leave the city. She goes through total revival of her writing. She writes her best poetry during the siege, and indeed she spends lots of time with her friend the rat. And preparing for our lecture, I just suddenly noticed all this, disgusting and beautiful pairings, right? The ghost of a cat, Krandievskaia and her rat, and also there is a beetle. All these siege partners, interlocutors, onto whom siege poets produce their speech. And last thing I would say, and again, for an American reader, for an American observer of this history, on some level, of course, it's remote and strange and difficult, but only on some level. I still think that one of the best books written about the siege, and it's something I'm writing about right now, was an American journalist, Harrison Salisbury, who wrote 900 Days, a very amusing and subtle book about what happened. He spent 25 years trying to decipher what happened. It's a book mostly about siege culture. And also in my experience, when I talk about this to the Americans, Germans, non-Russians, there is lots of understanding. Not only because people study history and they know about gulags and Holodomor and things like this, but also like all kinds of things, as we remember, happened in the 20th century. It was a very special century. But because there is something universal, all this, and this is an interesting thing about the siege, that it's such an horreur locale, right, with our personal connection to it. It's about my grandmother, and hence it's about me. But also there is something very, as I said, universal, global, connecting us all. Leningrad, Petersburg, one of the most, again, obscenely beautiful cities built on earth, turning into a ghost city. Of course, we can connect it to the fates of Hiroshima. Of course, we can connect it to the fate of Berlin in 1945. Just, it's a universal symbol of what we've done to ourselves in the 20th century, and something that kind of still calls for us, for our reading and for our research.
Thank you. I think as difficult as this conversation is with the eating of the cats and rats and ghosts and horror, it is critical for people who come from Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and for, as you mentioned, people everywhere, because in a way we are haunted by our history in so many ways. And if we don't speak about it, it's like psychoanalysis. It doesn't, it stays there, it's repressed, and it comes out in the even uglier representation. And that my next question is connected to that, to speaking about it versus not speaking about it. In a way, in the USSR, in the Soviet Union and Russia, and in Leningrad in particular, there was this almost a culture or an unspoken code of silence around pretty much anything about the history, and in particular the history of the siege. So say again, because it's so personal, I can't divorce it from my own history, so I'm going to go by that. I grew up and my school was around the area called Park Победы, which is a victory park, where we played, went ice skating in the winter, and would eat ice cream in summer. And only as I grew up, and I was already in America, that I found out that that was a place where the brick factory cremated 110,000 corpses. And in 2001, they installed a plaque that says the ashes of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and residents of the besieged Leningrad rest in ponds, lawns, underneath your feet. So in a way, my own great-grandparents could have been right there when I was ice skating, and it's mind-shattering, and no one spoke about it. And, you know, in a way, I mean, metaphorically and physically, we would find the rusty blank cartridges in the mud in the spring, just plain. And Zal'tsman wrote that кладбище весь этот город, this whole city is a cemetery. And it's true in a way, and yet there's this silence. And Alexander Etkind, the historian of culture, in his wonderful book Warped Grief, wrote something that I keep repeating in these shows because it really hit me, that it takes 2 generations to start speaking about the terrible events of the past. Only the 3rd generation finds the language to process the trauma. And another author that I like a lot and recommend reading, Esther Rushkin, who is a psychoanalyst and a literary scholar in the University of Utah. In her book, Psychoanalysis of Narrative, writes about the theory of phantom. And she says that a phantom is formed when a shameful, unspeakable secret is unwittingly transmitted through cryptic language and behavior transgenerationally. And then the haunted individual to whom the encrypted secret is communication becomes the unwitting medium for someone else's voice. So in a way, we're just repeating these gaps, these silences. So do you agree that publishing these books and reading these poems in this program and all the programs that you do unhaunts the St. Petersburg psyche and our collective mind?
First of all, I also grew by Park Победы. And there is something curious for me that you just described what I'm trying to describe with this particular place and experience of becoming who we are in the place that is filled with all kinds of silences. I really like this notion of phantom, and in a way I think it's perfect for Gnedich's poem, with which I'm kind of obsessed, because again it seems to be such a, you know, like личная вещь, личная штучка, such a personal thing, this poem. But simultaneously, it's a perfect text, almost, you know, like a reader, if one would be making a reader for today, for our generation, about a ghost, phantom, and shame. And all kinds of things that happen to language as a result of orgy between these elements. And in connection, since it's also so interesting to observe you with your questions, to see how you are formulating your feelings about it, your experiences, your readings about it. Of course, one of the main problems for us, for people from Park Победы and its outskirts, is the quest for language, right? We're looking for language to talk about them and their language. And this is why after I wrote all the chapters of the Седьмая щелочь, then the nightmare arrived of writing the intro, because most of my intro is about the description of the quest for language of writing about them. And that was quite an adventure to begin to formulate. Because one thing that rather often happened to me in this city, in various situations, when some remarkable people, very sensitive and sensible and gentle, would tell me, you know what, don't you think maybe you shouldn't be talking about this? Maybe it's not time to talk about this. Maybe we shouldn't touch them. And it would upset me hugely every time, because I know what they mean, people who say this. This being said, I think if we don't speak about this, something fatal might happen in the chain of transference of memory and information, as in our children won't at all be touched by the shadows. My daughter, who is 16 and a half, like, what would she know? So it's a huge problem to talk or not to talk, to produce speech about them or not. I would say, for me, the answer is yes, and rather it's a question of how, right? The question of, of course, it's an ethical question about gentleness. How gently you touch somebody else's wound in order for your own experience and silence to be in the process of healing, and not just like this yawning historical gap. The poem that I always read to people at kind of when we begin speaking about language and the siege is a poem by Pavel Zal'tsman, another absolutely fascinating figure, about whom we kind of guess. And again, this is about missing, right? This is about, there is this dreadful expression in Russian, пропавший без вести, that we all know, which means missing at the front, missing in battle. So our poets, many of them, and this experience that we're describing, in many situations, they are пропавшие с вестью. Just so much is not there, that there is some feeling of, you know, this pathological mosaic. We have one piece, but the next one is missing. And either it's a reconstruction task or what? Pavel Zal'tsman, about whom some people think that he participated in the burial of the most important artist, arguably one of the most important artists of that era, Pavel Filonov. The mystery of Filonov is that he is buried. We have the burial place. Most of the siege victims are not, as Zarina just said, they were put in the ravines, in all kinds of, they were left in the streets, and so on. Filonov was buried. We're still trying to understand how. Again, there is a rumor, and most, like so much what we know, quote unquote, about the siege is a rumor, which is a whole interesting conversation of its own, siege and knowledge. But yeah, Zal'tsman, a wit, dandy, a player, an amazing artist, and many of them of that generation, of that world, the combining poetry and visual art, which is also interesting and important. So this is one of his poems which I really, really cherish and find useful for explaining what was happening with the poetry. Ры. Я дурак, я дерьмо, я калека, я убью за колбасу человека. Но пустите нас, пожалуйста, в двери. Мы давно уже скребемся, как звери. Я ж страдаю палачи недержанием мочи. 17 сентября 1941 года. Translation by Charles Wang and Martin Kelevich. Growl. I'm a fool, I'm shit, I'm a wretch. I'll kill any man for sausage. But open up, please let us in. We've scratched like beasts for days on end. I suffer, you hungry man. I suffer, you hangman, can't you see, from urinary incontinency. So again, there is a huge question about translation, and there was a discussion of how to translate the title, and what in the original is ri becomes growl in English. Ri makes no sense. This is indeed the sound of nonsense, something that this group of poets sought after, experimented with. But the problem is that what they explored in the 1920s and then later became their realities during the siege. And to some extent, of course, especially like this poem just kind of so awfully and brilliantly thematizes it, that how do you write the end of language? How do you write the crisis? How do you write the state of ours that language doesn't work anymore, it's broken? As I said, like I like this notion of damage. How do you write damaged language? I know that we all are discussing, we've been discussing this last year, what happens to us if we actively begin comparing this year and that year, whether it's productive at all or ethical at all. But this whole year of the COVID with its tragedies and difficulty. And one thing that we already notice, that we do observe and witness lack and problem of language. So one thing that comes to the surface when we deal with the as like moment of historical crisis and expression, for us, people of the craft, it's so fascinating to see how authors, poets observe and notice that language doesn't work anymore, and what they make out of it, how they use the crisis of language for their own language work. And with all the poets in both anthologies, it's a question, especially since I said they are so different. And I'm talking now about some people whom I would love to introduce to you, but they're becoming more and more known. And like these last days, we're waiting for the new book of selected works of Gore coming out in Petersburg. So we cannot say that they're completely in silence anymore. But nevertheless, when we compare them to glitterati of the moment, to people like Tikhonov and Bergolz, but so language of we've been talking recently so much about these unofficial poets, unofficial siege poets, that at some point I decided that it's also interesting to bring them in one conversation, right? With people who worked for propaganda tasks and who were creating very different kind of language, sometimes also absolutely fascinating. Because again, I feel that sometimes serious conversation about Bergolz, one of the most interesting figures of the Soviet century, and controversial figures consisting of many layers, psychologically, personally, creatively, that bringing them together in one book, in one conversation, for one effort for us readers. I think it, as I've mentioned before, it gives some new levels of understanding to how we understand Soviet language as a problem, and especially Soviet language in its creation at its most acute moments.
You answered another question that I had about the language, of course, with the re being untranslatable. So in a way, there's the whole other question, and I think it probably would be another program for our literary translation table. How do you find this language in a second degree of separation for the re? I mean, to me, it brought the horror of Conrad, and but in a way, it's like almost not expressible. It's in the book, Rudakov, I think, mentions Laocoon, the figure frozen in stone from horror. And of course, that figure is in the Hermitage. Like for people in St. Petersburg, you grow up with it, you live with this horror. But I think that will open the whole other can of snakes, so to say. So I will move on to the question of which you just touched upon with Bergolz and Tikhonov, about this whole phenomena of double personality or split personality that existed in the Soviet Union on every level, not just for writers. Everybody had their official persona and their non-official kitchen hidden persona. So it's, you know, the phenomena of multiple poetry persona that poets in this book also had, like Gore or Slutsky, and you write about that. And in a way, Leningrad in particular, even for the Soviet Union, demonstrates symptoms of dissociative identity disorder. And if we go to the book, it is the disconnection and lack of continuity between thoughts, memories, surroundings, actions, and identity. And this disorder develops as a reaction to trauma, to block painful memories. And that's exactly what we seen in the history of the city. The symptoms are all here, from collective amnesia to alternative identities and names. There is St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad, St. Petersburg again, when most people just call it Peter, so all these names come here to the light. And also there's the memory loss of certain time periods and events. And more than anything, when you live there and grow up there, there's this palpable sense of being detached, and there's a perception of things around as distorted or unreal, surreal even, and a blurred sense of identity, which is also a symptom of dissociative personality disorder. You mentioned the term blockade surrealist, which is an organic part of the post-utopian Soviet uncensored literature. And it developed in the late 30s and then was revived in the 50s and 60s after the siege. And that for me was very tangible, in a way, tangible, intangible, in the poetry of Gore and Rudakov and Zal'tsman. And so while putting together this poetry and working on translation and editing, how did you experience this split personality?
First of all, I have to thank you immediately for the image of Laocoon as the can of snakes. This is something for my next poem. In general, the question of ekphrasis and traumatic ekphrasis, for which Laocoon is one of the main emblems, is a very siege problem. One of the things that struck me when I began studying this material, this archive, what now seems to be life ago, was when I began finding diaries with lots of illustrations. And when in general, I began understanding that people are trying to work with different languages, right, in the Jacobsonian sense. People who never thought about themselves as artists before this experience began aggressively, desperately doodling, creating all kinds of visual representations, because words they felt were not enough, were not adequate. Same for the artists who began writing. For example, we're still waiting for the full publication of the Siege Black Note notepad of Tatiana Glebova, maybe the most remarkable woman artist of the period, that has images and texts, and in general, that happens a lot. And of course, we know of many similar phenomena from Terezin and so on. Again, what happened in the siege is absolutely not unique for the 20th century, but it's extremely pregnant with material and food for thought for the Soviet century for a number of reasons, because Leningrad was a beast of its own species for a number of reasons. Some of them you just mentioned. So closer to the core of your question, I would say that almost with every author that I had honor to work with, to think about, without exceptions, these were people who attempted to be a part of the culture of their moment. Rudakov desperately tries to get published, goes to Moscow, flirts with Shklovsky, flirts with Tynyanov. Like, again, we know that it is a nature of our, again, species, of our profession, of our craft. We want to find a reader. We want not only to get the prize, which is also rather pleasant, but that happened to Tikhonov. Of the characters of the Седьмая Щелочь, Tikhonov gets the Siege Prize for his poetry, for his extremely strange poem about Kirov, right? The problematic and legendary leader of the city, communist leader of the city, who gets killed in 1934, which leads to the totally disastrous consequence of the remains of intelligentsia and nobility being exiled and shot. So Tikhonov writes this very Lermontovian, I would say, poema about Kirov, who gets up from his coffin and goes walking around the city. There is also, with Tikhonov, there is this notion of the siege romanticism. And again, as you've noticed, In many things that they write, there is this notion of the phantom. It just, it being a cat or it being a Kirov, there is something very strange in every time, and not just spooky, but obnoxious. And there are all kinds of slippages of style. And this is why it's so interesting to read it. In the book, I write about Tikhonov's prose, which has phantoms of its own. And again, this is my reading, this is my interpretations. I so do hope that people will come and argue and people will bring their interpretations. And by the way, some remarkable young scholars already do, and I will mention them. But even with Tikhonov, if you see closely, you understand that this course has many layers. And Tikhonov, who was once seen as perhaps, I know it's strange vocabulary, but a stand-in for Gumilev, and again, potential future big poet. Everything is big in that culture, большой дом, большой поэт. But then something really strange happens. Secret police prepares дело писателей, the writer's affair, in the 1930s. The leader of that conspiracy was supposed to be, according to the secret police, Tikhonov. Tikhonov is not arrested. Many other people, some of our beloved authors are arrested. Zabolotsky is arrested and goes to camps. And as a result of all this horrific strangeness, Tikhonov becomes the most Soviet figure possible. It's a very curious metamorphosis, if you wish. And according to merciless people like Lydia Ginsburg and others, during the siege, basically Tikhonov loses his humanity and becomes a solid propaganda ideal persona. But even with Tikhonov, especially with Soviet propaganda ideal persona, there is, maybe it's my own pathology, but there is something curious in looking at their texts very, very closely and seeing in what on the surface has only surface, seeing in their work some increments, some remains of what was Tikhonov circa 1926, maybe even 1921, or his poems about Caucasus of the 1930s, when he was compared by many equal to Pasternak. So when you look at the Soviet characters of poetry like that, you see their lost potentials. But when you look at people like, as I say, Gnedich and Gor, whom rather often today, sometimes we have inclination to read only as a Soviet, not anti-Soviet, that would be a little bit pathetic and too much, but a Soviet. But even with them, right, it is my understanding, and it's very personal. It is where I am now. I'm almost 45. I also have my history of relationship with that century and so on, that everybody who went with this history, who collected that language, who went through this, had many layers. And both publishable and unpublishable, both official and non-official, whatever rubrics we use, they were of their century. For example, there is a chapter and a relationship in this book, which absolutely fascinates me, because it has Mandelstam as a secondary figure, which is a rather cool thing for the studies of Soviet poetry. Mandelstam is, when he was exiled to Voronezh, met a very peculiar young gentleman, Sergey Rudakov, who was obsessed with Mandelstam and spent lots of time trying to convince, to push Mandelstam to go on writing after a pause. And Rudakov succeeded, which of course is a very interesting Nabokovian sujet. After that, the roads fork, they go different ways. Rudakov later finds himself in the siege and continues writing, very strange, post-Acmeist, also somewhat, that's a problematic word, but very interesting, very seductive, surrealist poetry. And he also writes about the task of the siege poetry. But when you look at all of them, you understand, I understand, at least, like it's very useful to say it's my responsibility, my point of view, that they all actually, on some level, they wanted to be of their time. Oh, and I guess this is yet another reason why looking at the siege is so useful in a way for research, because it's very much their time. There is something very much kind of about timeliness of this work of poetry. And, you know, sometimes, of course, I endlessly talk to my friends, some of whom I see at the moment in front of me, which is kind of both beautiful and embarrassing. And this, like, I do, somebody studies like the whole Augustan Roman period. Somebody studies the whole period of, I don't know, young Pushkin or something like this. Well, last 15 years I spent studying 3 months. And I still feel that I studied, I don't know, 1% of this 3 months, a little bit more, maybe 3 years actually. But this very fascination of looking at Soviet poets, poets of Soviet century, in one situation, trying their language, trying to see where their language will take them, куда их заведет язык, what their language is able for, open for. Observing this, reading them, it's absolutely fascinating as an exercise in reading.
I can only imagine, because I had to work through a lot of resistance to read, because I was haunted, as mentioned before, and every line would bring 10 other lines, and I admire you for doing this. You also practically answered one of my next questions about censorship. So I just want to comment here that, you know, with this Tikhonov's poem with a ghost, and it just occurred to me when you were saying that going back to the repression in a way, because they were doing so much of self-censorship, they were repressing this, and so that's why there's so many ghosts that coming out. They, you know, it's totally Freudian in a way, and for a psychologist probably to look into it and explore it further, but looks like this whole self-censorship or unconscious censorship has something to do with the resistance and not wanting to go where it's too terrible, and not just in the siege, but just, you know, within the psyche. Because you answered so well the whole question and the issue of censorship, I want to move on, and we're very lucky today. We have Julia Trubihina and we have Eugenia Stashevsky joining us, so there will be an interesting discussion after the interview. But I still had a few questions that I would very much like to hear your answers to. And one of them is the way in which we process the siege, and in a way they started to process the siege and what they lived through, and that's the whole myth or mythology. And here I want to bring up Roland Barthes' mythologies, in which he shows that how objects and ideas conveyed and replicated by any type of social discourse, and I quote, such as the written word, photography, film, publicity, lose their realness and turn into messages. And then they form a system of communication that is used by the social system as a power tool. And so society is controlled by the myths, any society, not just the Soviet Union, and by the narratives. And inevitably, artists also integrate the myths, internalize them, and become susceptible to mythology on an unconscious level. But that is usually. And to me, reading these poems in your books seemed that this сошедшая с ума природа, the nature gone mad, the time so severely out of joint, did not allow these poets to internalize the myths completely. In a way, they were pushed too close to death to create myths. And having said that, can we talk about the myths and narratives that were created around the siege? I want to bring up the example of which you probably have heard or know more than I do. A long time ago, when I was still in Leningrad, and it still was Leningrad, one of my first jobs, I translated for the BBC documentary director. And it was a project that researched the whole legend of Tanya Savicheva, a legendary little girl who kept a diary during the siege, writing down the death of each family member. And of course, it reminded everyone of Anne Frank and her diary. And she was almost a saint for a child who grew up in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad. And so I was devastated at the time to find out and see some documents confirming that her diary was falsified. So Tanya Savicheva existed, but I can't remember now. She either did not have a diary or the entries in a diary were fraud. They didn't exist. And I think I was so horrified that I just tried to repress it and forget all about it. Right now, in modern Russia, there's another myth being created and used and abused. And I just want to mention that a couple of years ago, writing an article about the Immortal Regiment, I found out the advertising for the siege bread tasting, дегустация блокадного хлеба, for the celebration of the Victory Day. And I was absolutely horrified. So publishing the poetry and written in the dark helps to debunk this mythical speech and destroy the pathos that is acquired in the process of social discourse of which Barthes is writing. So by this act of desacralization, which I hear is the word of the week in Russia these days, this last week, desacralization of the power. But as applied to your book, you strip the fake form that the time and politics imposed on the real event and unveil and unmummify the siege. So what is your take on the myths that were created around the siege?
Wow, every question is a prompt for an essay. I absolutely agree that reading them helps us just to be aware of their versions of reality. Even sometimes, even though sometimes we absolutely suspect and feel that they rigorously are attempting to create myths of their own. And even for me, formally impeccable poetry of Gnedich, who writes either in octaves, because she's translator of Byron, or she writes some sonnet forms. It's already mythology, right? On some level, but of course on much more sophisticated and playful than creating these endless Soviet monuments. Tanya Savicheva existed, unlike many other historical slash non-historical constructions slash fake news created after that war. Tanya Savicheva existed. Her Knižička existed. It was not a diary per se, if we're talking about genres. It was a little zapisnaya knižička, address book, taken, meaning stolen by her from her sister, who survived. The tragedy of Tanya Savicheva's narrative, so to say, is that Tanya not only survived, but lived for years in evacuation, and story of her death, which took several years, there is something just in telling it as it was, that Tanya was dying a slow post-dystrophy death. There were attempts to save these children. They were feeding them, and many children evacuated already. It's next spring, right? Because the first evacuation failed, but she was evacuated, and her body completely did not want to be, so to say. She was losing limbs. She had TB of her bones. Her post-dystrophy story is quite something. It's described by people who were around her. And this very fact that she didn't disappear, right? Another thing about the siege story, that for somebody who studies it, that these people disappear. The dystrophy, you find it much in the diaries as a kind disease. One just falls asleep or gets lost somewhere in the streets of the dark Petersburg / Leningrad. So, and they are gone. Again, we're dealing with this language of phantomization. But no, Tanya was, for years after the siege, she was, but nobody wanted to know that story. We, who are we, the city wanted, the official memory wanted to focus on that little book instead of seeing the whole picture. And this is where the notion of censorship is, of course, rather fascinating again and again and again. By the way, so we are endlessly complaining, meaning I'm endlessly complaining, nitik, that there is so much of siege remaining for study, but great things do happen. For example, the team of Sokolovskaya, it's a literature historian, literator in the city. They recently created an exhibition created to the Blokadная kniga archive of Granin and Adamovich, which is a huge step. I can only hope that we will witness, our generation, this kind of effort dedicated to the archive of Radio Committee, which is where the culture of the siege basically to the serious extent was happening, because it's there, and it's in the Central Archive of Literature and Literatura Искусства and Visual Arts. You can see how they wrote, and you can see how census worked. You can see census working on the texts of Bergholz, Ginsburg, Schwartz, Kaverin, in their pencils of different colors. And in a way, that would be, I think, such an important and curious and telling project to understand how, from the very beginning, from the very formative years of the events, how the siege was censored. Not only the aftermath that you are talking about with our endlessly problematic memory, right? But how this problem actually started. And the whole conversation, right, about censorship, it's huge and endless, and one of the most important parts of the whole conversation of how culture was made of that time and place. Mythology of the siege, again, where do you want to go? You want to go to talk about Tanya Savage, one kind of mythology. You want to go and talk about cannibalism, another kind of mythology. There is a wonderful book, which I really appreciate. And in general, for me, this is such a feast, such a great thing to say. There is a book. There is a book about a rumor as a cognitive mechanism and a social mechanism during the siege, by historian Vladimir Pinkevich. It's one of my favorite books. And the whole problem of the, fake news is such an abused notion at this time that it's almost a non-notion. But it's not this generation who invented it. Right? There were some really cool teachers. So creating the body of information that is ideally in no correlation with the so-called reality, and having a whole city of people trying to figure out the actions and situation in accordance with the lack of information, right? That kind of crime and that kind of disaster as the originating pattern matrix for the next 70 years of us and our parents, and the chances are our children kind of swimming in this nauseating soup of, is this real, is this real, is this fake, who was Tanya Savitcheva, and so on. And the answer is extremely primitive. On some level, read and publish and go to the archives.
Well, fair enough, yes, to bring it to light and do the close reading and demystify. Right. And that's what Barth actually offers to demystify. And so, because I really wanna go to the question and answers, I'm gonna ask my last question. I'm gonna combine two in one, and I'm gonna try and do that. And I don't know if it's gonna work, but I'll try. So, because I saved the hardest question for the very end, and it was hard to think of it. It was hard to put it into words, and it would be hard to say it, and probably would be hard to answer. But as the second part of this question comes the defense mechanism. So I'm trying to defend myself from the harshness of the question right away. So the first question about the main taboo of the mythology and the story and the real story of the siege, which you just mentioned in the last answer, and it's the cannibalism. And as a child in St. Petersburg and Leningrad, when you grew up, you heard it in the most horrifying type of way. Nobody would really speak about it, but you heard some whispers, and you heard some rumors, and you heard that somebody's grandmothers did something or saw something, and that's why she's crazy, or that in this yard, in this dark corner, and there comes the urban legend. It's almost like the horror story that each city has. The dark hand reaches out for you, only it was real, because here that's where the cannibal lived, in this yard on the Kuznetsovskaya Ulitsa. And so your childhood imagination makes the monsters out of it that haunt you, again, the phantom and haunting theme, you at night and in your nightmares all the way to your adulthood and into now. And the one way to deal with it, I think that the city found, and that the poets in your book have found, like Gore and Zal'tsman, is the laughter. There's one of the most horrifying poem by Gore is Rebecca, about the act of consuming human flesh, and the raven, and that feels like some, like very obvious Edgar Poe references, and but it's almost black humor, right? And it's, of course, it's very harms too. You cannot not feel it there. And then there are some Zal'tsman poets too, with this round back, that they're waiting for food. And it's also funny in this like completely sacrilegious type of laughter way. And I think from what I remember from my childhood and teenage years also, that the generations to come also internalized and then developed this humor and applied it to the things that were going on, commemorating the siege. So I lived, close to Park Победы, but also close to the Площадь Победы, which is the square of victory. Everything is victory, 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 right? And there, when I still vaguely remember the construction of the monument, which everybody referred to as a stamestka, which is the chisel. And it did look like a chisel. And then, there were all kind of jokes which were completely inappropriate, even in my family, about it. And my family, like I mentioned before, lost members, and it was memory that people spoke with respect. At the same time, they were laughing. So that probably I take as a built-in defense. And with that kind of vinaigrette and the Russian salad of thoughts, I hand it over to you. So what do you say about cannibalism and the laughter?
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, this is a question that sooner or later somebody was supposed to happen, because it's a good question, because Gore is funny. How funny? This is something that I still need to think more about. But combination of horror and laughter is a very, if we can use this word, it's very strong combination when it works. And they had teachers who went very far in their quest, being harms, and I would say especially Aleynikov, and Vidensky, of course, right, who constantly tried to come to some kind of limit of the horrific, of the abyss. And obviously the siege poets of this kind, they just really met their material. And this, of course, is the most obvious and most unbelievable part of this experiment, if we can call this an experiment, that they really, as with Ginsburg wrote so much, all that they needed, they had devices, they needed historical material. And this historical material happened to them in a way. Gore is funny, Gore is strange. He's, for example, the first poem that I read about убийца будет целоваться, улыбаться, там, где умываться. One of my go-to poems, what happens to the reflective ся, and to this whole kind of sam and ya in this poem. because it's even worse than that with this series of poems. It's laughter and cannibalism, murder, and it's also very, very erotic. All these poems are about some kind of attraction between members, of this poem that is almost painful and also weirdly pleasant to observe. Again, we're talking about poems very well made. And laughter that emerges as a result of strangeness. Something is off and we laugh, right? This, if we decide to, there are many descriptions of pleasure, but awkwardness and surprise being one of them. And this is one of many things that happen in the cannibalism series of Gore. After Ostashevsky and team translated this series, I read them a lot to my students. And also what's I find to be curious is that when I read these poems to the Russian audiences, the usual reaction is total, ideal, impenetrable, and disastrous silence. And there we sit in silence for some time. When I read this to American students, in my experience, there is very strong immediate response and conversation. Again, we can, it's a complicated issue why for Americans it's not their personal shame. Americans read Celan. Americans are somewhat prepared by various previous readings and discussions. For people in Leningrad, it's very much about themselves, their families, and lack of previous open discussions and completely different contexts. But nevertheless, every time I'm amazed by how the poem «Я девушку съел хохотунью Ребекку», how differently it works in different contexts today. I would say that yes, laughter, yes, irony, especially for me, especially in Zal'tsman. There is place to that. Usually when people ask me about this book, Седьмая щелочь, so you studied it, what did you find? After all, we claim we might be lying or lying to ourselves, but we claim that we find something as a result of our research. I found that none of them invented any new poetic devices, forms, that they were very connected to what they were doing before in their previous disasters, right, during the 1930s, for example. But in almost all the cases, they really, really developed their apparatus. They went very far with what they had already. For example, and this is what I'm excited about at the moment. I mentioned there are younger scholars coming. It's remarkable Petersburg scholar Andrei Muzhdaba is working on Gore, and he is writing about Gore's poetry that some of our colleagues, friends, interlocutors found to be absolutely, kind of abnormal phenomenon of that moment, that actually Gore, everything that Gore wrote in his life is in conversation. And in his early poetry, there is also horrific laughter and violence and strange fascination with strange nature. So in general, to answer your impossible, great, big question, they're using everything they can. Those of them у кого есть склонность to use laughter, they really go after it, and sometimes with absolutely fascinating results.
Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
The answers were fascinating, and I am very excited to make it a round table.
I wanted to both ask and comment on the title. I absolutely love the title, obviously. It's a great title, Седьмая щелочь. When I first heard the title, I thought, what is the great mystery? From what I remember from my chemistry course in high school, and I was not a very good student of chemistry, I just assumed that she was like talking about the alkali metals, that there are 6 of them. It's the first group in the Mendeleev table: lithium, potassium, sodium, and I forgot what, something else, like francium, I think. They're wonderful. I remember that from high school, that when you put them in flame, they all have spectral colors, all different spectral colors. And when you dissolve them in water, that's what gives you hydroxide, щелочь. And I thought that because the 7th doesn't exist, this is certainly about, like, opens up the whole idea of like another color of the spectrum, the unknown element that's been the known щелочь, that alkali metal and alkali hydride, hydroxide, that is not known in nature, that's created in that в тигле этого года. Mm-hmm. But frankly, I think that because Krandievskaia was not known for ever studying chemistry, and she was very much a literary family, I think that she's simply talking about mercury, which is one of the 7 elements, that 7 metals that are known from ancient times. And the legend, as you, I think, mentioned in alchemy, is that if you take it's quicksilver, it's liquid metal. It's one of the, I think, few, maybe the only one, liquid metal, that somehow if you use sulfur and arsenic and turn it back into solid, it will give you gold. And so it's somehow getting gold as a result of that horrible year. But because you are not bound by only Krandievskaia, even though it's sort of a quote, I think it opens up a whole nice spectrum of meaning. I said that the alkali metals, they're what we learned in high school, there were only 6, so the 7th doesn't exist. But so when I first read the title of the book, I was like, седьмая щелочь, what the hell is that? So I started looking up the 7th element. Does it exist? It turns out that the chemists predicted that it will be discovered. I don't know how they predict, but I guess like planets, they somehow know by the mass that it has to be in that table. And they predict that it will be discovered this year or next year. So it must be your year. And it's already has a name, and I looked it up. It's absolutely unpronounceable. Unenium or unenium.
Send it to me. After hopeless interviewing and harassing my friends in chemistry, and again, every specialist on Alexei Tolstoy, we were able to trace in the universe. My understanding is that it's an impossible element, and also that the notion is connected to the alchemia. And in my understanding, the title is about alchemia, right? What happens as a result of the 1941 in poetry.
Dmitry Manin says, just a comment, I hear Sedmaya Shelach as the umpteenth cleaning, frivolously speaking, like в семи водах со скипидаром.
Yep.
Maybe I'm totally wrong, because Shelach is a hard cleaning agent.
This was suggested already. Some kind of cleansing. Since the next line in that poem of Krandievskaia, that the year омыл, God омыл нас, right? So I guess this reading is also there. As we chose this as a title for a book about them, because it has all these пучки смыслов. It's a cleansing operation, horrific, nevertheless efficient. It's some kind of alchemic process that creates a new quality of language and thinking. I think it's all there. I also talked about Gnedich because I'm a little bit obsessed obsessed with her at the moment, and also because we just began getting her stuff from the archive. Thank you, people who work with Gnedich and Pushkinsky Dom. We have access now, and as you can imagine, there is this, again, out of the dark it comes. But in the book, I talk a lot about Krandievskaia, a very interesting figure, I think, because she manages to write this, also, I use this term, beautiful poetry, as in pleasant, as in very much in tradition, that by then is already accepted by certain part of Russian language poetry, the Silver Age. There is certain comfort to this, but then in this comfort, you see actually бездна of certain kind, little, again, shifts of meaning, little moments of word play, and suddenly this comfort, like in a horror movie, the family happily arrives to the house, and then some strange sounds begin. And somebody knocks at the door, of course, to measure the temperature. And then we have 2 hours of the horror movie. So sometimes I think of Krandievskaia's poetry like this very subtle and very subtly organized machine of horror, because this very notion of thank you, the year 1941, for inspiration. And then you actually think about this woman, this poet, and this price of inspiration, and you think, bloody hell. The very fact that she arrived to her strongest poetry and how she did it, it's almost, there is something very, very difficult when one thinks about it.
First of all, I want to say hi. I'm talking to you. It's morning in Shanghai, so it's tomorrow. I want to say thank you for this incredible discussion. And it also feels like a family conversation and like a dinner conversation, except it's COVID, but it's by Zoom. Dinner conversation about cannibalism. And it's funny to be having it in English because it makes me feel like a Tolstoyan character speaking French,
right?
Because the object is so bound up with Russian. So in light of it being a family conversation, I'm going to allow myself a couple of comments, and I hope that they go together, and they're a bit impressionistic. So one, about kind of a long view of the blockade as a phenomenon. The blockade is an extremely, the hunger siege is a traditional and an archaic form of warfare, even though it happened in Syria a few years ago. But it's a kind of warfare that is associated, that was the norm in the ancient world in the Middle Ages, right? You surround the city, you have it starve. Right. So when I started thinking about the blockade of Leningrad very intensely over the past couple of years, I found it impossible to think about it without earlier examples. Even, you know, I'm not going to give you a bunch of examples, but even with cannibalism, it's not just a trope in the Siege of Leningrad, it's a trope of siege writing that goes all the way from, I don't know, goes from Mesopotamia, right? Montaigne's De Cannibal ultimately comes out of a work about the siege of Sancerre, a history of the siege of Sancerre during the French Wars of Religion, where the author of the work had earlier been a missionary in Brazil, wrote a book about Brazil, and his question was, you know, so there was cannibalism during the siege, how are we not cannibals, right? So, I mean, sieges in hunger sieges have had an incredible historical effect that we don't talk about it. Oh man, sorry, they want to measure my temperature. Give me just 1 second.
Wow.
Okay, I'm in quarantine. Temperature, okay. Okay, so I was thinking about a more successful siege in the sense that it's a siege where the invader actually broke into the city and destroyed the center of the city. And I'm thinking of the Siege of Jerusalem by the Romans, right, by Titus. And we have a pretty good idea of the effects of that. And of course, it was a hunger siege. You know, people were dying of hunger, there was cannibalism, it's a more traumatic event, if I may say so, than the Siege of Leningrad, because the city in the end was completely wiped out. Right? What that led to was a complete rewriting of Judaism, and it led to the rise of Christianity, right? Because, you know, the material in the Gospels that are written around that time and afterwards really begins to make sense only in the context of the Jewish war. So incredible historical effect, right? So my first question, and I realize it's an unanswerable question, but in a way, the long-term effect of this siege, right? The historical effect, not just the effect on us who grew up with Tanya Savitcheva, right? Or who were told about Tanya Savitcheva when they were, I don't know, how old were we, 5? So, you know, what effect would that have? And I know it's it's the Soviet Union, so it's like one trauma among many, but it's a pretty big trauma. So, and then the other connection that I want to make is about the traumatized language of the poetry, right? And it's again a historical connection. So as somebody who works on Abiriu, and I know I use sometimes the term absurdism, I used it a long time ago. I used it purely for commercial purposes because I just didn't think I could explain this stuff otherwise, right? But when I actually, think of this kind of writing, it's not absurdism, it's not surrealism, right? If you really want to think about it, it's realism. Because it's just a much better description of reality as reality actually is than the kind of ideological stuff that walks around in the mantle of realism, right? It doesn't mean that я девушку съел хохотунью Rebecca means that he actually ate somebody named Rebecca, right? That's not what I mean by realism, right? But it addresses these questions of the siege in a way that the other stuff just doesn't. It's not capable of doing it, right? It's not capable. This has to do with the role of humor. We have this weird classicist idea that humor doesn't really belong in these things, but you can't have realism without humor, right? Because to say that, you know, I can describe reality without being funny means that what I'm claiming is that reality is perfectly rational and logical and consistent, and that I understand it. Right? But that's not a tenable claim. That's not, you know, in any kind of system, much less in a system where, you know, a whole city is being starved to death. Reality is, if it's rational, it's not rational in any kind of way that we can possibly understand and calculate. Right? So humor is not some kind of extra thing. It's not a spice. It's part of the dish. Right? It's an optic. It has to do with reality being inconsistent, period. Reality is it is inconsistent, okay? And this is the end of my harangue, and I'm going to bring it back to the Siege of Jerusalem, or historical sieges. In a way, the really big predecessor and an example of a Beriou style writing, right, of what we call absurd writing, is the Bible, right? The Bible, if you actually read the Bible, right, unlike most people who say they read the Bible, right, it's a text that's completely contradictory, that makes no sense, and that's incredibly funny, right? It's incredibly funny, and it's also, in lots and lots of ways, it's very honest, right? All characters, including God, keep doing things that really are very, very embarrassing if you stop to think of it for a second. And the Bible, in its inconsistencies, in its weirdnesses, in things that completely come out of, you know, God knows where, or doesn't know where, it's a strikingly gore-like or Harmsian or whatever text, right? I just think that our literary categories, in lots of ways, are just very wrong. I actually had these framed as questions, but whatever, I got carried away after they took my temperature. So the question is, I mean, in a way, with the blockade, what kind of historical, not just psychological thrust, but what kind of historical wake can we see in that?
I think it's a very good question, but also with as many answers and as many takers as every particular reader might find there. I really like many things. I really dig many things that you brought to your monologue. The siege has its own history with that creates not just one perspective, but perspectives and connections. I really like this. For example, another siege that many people who are in Leningrad, intelligente историки, archivisты, that they are writing about is the Siege of Paris in the 19th century. And also it's kind of important because there is a famous film of the young Soviet cinema called New Babylon by Kozintsev. And this is when Kozintsev is trying to think of his Siege of Leningrad film that he never makes, but he writes the script, which we have, and we're still trying to understand what to do with it. It's not published. We don't have an official yes to publish it because a wonderful family of Kozintsev thinks that it's too funny. Which again brings us to something that you said that I find to be endlessly touching and useful, actually, that when we analyze optics used, for example, by the authors of Siege of Leningrad, the question is, or maybe we can allow that it's not their optics that is off, but ours. That maybe we can finesse our instruments of interpretation. And what you said about realism, I think actually, seriously speaking, it would be very useful at some time in the predictable, non-predictable future for some of us to get together and think about realism in connection to Abreu and siege poets, because some things that happen there, I suspect, might really help us with our definitions. Because I find what you just said, that actually to use the term surrealism is superficial and not that useful. They were not doing Max Ernst to their surroundings. They actually were extremely precise and, if you wish, faithful to their material. The material was such that the very notion of realism began morphing and moving and asking its own questions and opening, in some Videnskian sense, to create new opportunities for the shifts of logics and laughter as a result of it. These are questions that I think are possible because we work with this material. These are questions that this material asks of us as readers. And maybe these are some of the most urgent, interesting things to talk about today. So both parts of your non-question, I find them useful and profoundly, fascinatingly irritating, and I will think about them.
Marino, as a question, is Tikhonov's Kirov somehow growing out of the bronze horseman?
That's smart. Tikhonov's Kirov has all kinds of intertexts. As I've mentioned, obviously it's Bonaparte, as we remember, who comes to visit his army and his past. I would say that Tikhonov's Kirov is much friendlier than the bronze horseman, who, as we remember, is a rather angry guardian of the city. He's rather grumpy and rather difficult in relationship to his citizens. But it's an interesting direction. It's an interesting notion. I will look at it again. In general, I would say poema Kirov s nami is something else in its, again, passionate desire to be an exemplary Soviet texts, and on its way to becoming that, it has this strange, again, openings of things that really, really surprise a reader in 2021, and relationship of the dead leader of the Bolshevik city with his city and with the future authority. It's a text about authority and the dying city. And of course, actually, I think it's a very interesting one. It's a very curious one, because the very notion, the very problem at that moment was very hot and hot to touch. It was dangerous. So Tikhonov, again, who just recently survived, we have no idea how and why, what broke in the secret police machine, how he managed to escape the danger. He knew that he was writing a dangerous text. that he didn't make a mistake, right? And like the mistake of Ovid, that he wrote a successful text and got his prize, might also be explained by the fact that readers were not really close readers. And now we see stranger things in this text. It's not that I ask you all to begin rereading Tikhonov and Kirov s nami. There are some more special pleasures in life. But I read it and found it curious, and found that bringing it together with the texts by other people interested in formal poetry at the moment, reading Tikhonov's poema together with the extremely elaborate formal constructions of Gnedich. As I said, I will be thinking about what Zhenya just said. On some level, speaking of what is realism and what is real, I think it's much more, there is something much more, what is the word? Understandable, humane, at least for the creature of my kind, when I read, I don't know, gore about the siege, than when one reads Gnedich's Vinok Sonetov about the siege. And that very notion that one can create such an elaborate thing of beauty about cannibalism and whatnot, that opens its own set of questions. That was one of the most unbelievable conversations of my life. Thank you, Zarina. For people who want to continue asking questions, I'm very findable through my Hampshire address, for example. So kind of to say again, thank you. So this is the book. As everything that Limbach does, it's pleasing to the eye and to the touch. But also it has a picture on the cover by Yakov Rubinchik, the artist, who during the winter created series, hundreds of sketches about the siege with the unbelievably funny commentaries. And there was an exhibition recently, Музей истории города. Now there is a book of his work. And again, developing this whole conversation. And it was Eugen, of course. And then he said that he is sorry, but the not very difficult pun of gore and gore was born. So combination of gore and laughter. And that language that is trying to... язык, который пытается быть вне себя, right? And in this very process, it's still trying to find its new self. I think this question, this quest, this process of reading them is just so immensely interesting. And this is to your first question, Zarina, how you can do it. On some level, I'm still not very sure how anybody can do anything else, but this is my personal problem. And people like my friends and colleagues and co-translators.
Thank you, Polina. It was very, very special for me, for everyone. Everybody is saying thank you. We ran out of time. We had more questions, but everyone thanks you for the inspiring conversation, and really thank you for doing this. I hope it's the first but not the last conversation, because you mentioned that it would be interesting to do the discussion of the terms of the realism, and Globus would like to host that. So
let's continue talking.
For our audience, please check out our winter and spring schedule. We have a lot of interesting discussions coming. There's a Ukrainian modern surrealist novel. There's Volzhina Mort coming in spring. There is a new book in Russian about the biography of the first Russian transgender who moved to America, a biography that is fascinating, with a talk on the Silver Age poets. There are some political talks. There's actually a culinary show on Ukrainian desserts for Valentine's Day. And do subscribe for our channel, because that's one way that we can continue bringing you these conversations and these voices that need to be heard. Thank you so much for being with us today, and stay well, stay sane, stay safe in 2021, and see you soon. Bye now.